the crown. It shines with gold and jewels. It promises power. It promises glory. For centuries, people have imagined what it must be like to wear it. They dream of limitless control, of everyone bowing down. But the reality is much heavier. Our history shows us a different truth. It shows us kings who went mad, who lived in fear, who carried burdens no human should. Consider King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He built stunning castles, but he also retreated from his duties, isolated himself, and, some say, spiraled into mental illness. He died under mysterious circumstances. Or think of the many Roman emperors. A few died peacefully in their beds. Many faced betrayal, assassination, constant threat. Even modern monarchs, stripped of absolute power, speak of the immense pressure. In Queen Elizabeth II, for example, lived a life of unwavering duty. But imagine the personal cost of constant scrutiny, of always representing an institution, of rarely being just a person. The numbers are stark. In studies of leadership show that high-ranking positions often come with increased stress, anxiety, and even depression. Historical data points to shorter lifespans for many rulers compared to the general population of their time. The average reign length for Roman emperors was just over 5 years. Many did not see old age. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about the human mind under extreme pressure. It's about what happens when one person is expected to be everything: a symbol, a leader, a protector, a judge, a figurehead. It asks a profound question. Does the crown elevate a person, or does it crush them? What secrets does the throne hold about the limits of human endurance, about the dark side of power, and about the true price of being the king? Number 16, does absolute power corrupt? Absolutely. Lord Acton's famous line, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," still echoes today. It's not just a moral statement, it's a psychological one. When a person has unlimited authority, it changes their brain. It changes how they see others. Research by Professor Dr. Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley, and his colleagues has explored this idea. Their studies show that people with power often lose empathy. They become less able to take the perspective of others. They might even act more impulsively. Think about Roman Emperor Caligula. Early in his reign, he was popular. But over time, he became known for his cruelty and bizarre behavior. He made his horse a consul. He had people executed for minor offenses. Historians debate if he was insane or just corrupted by power. Either way, his actions show a severe psychological shift. Similarly, Nero, another Roman emperor, started out well. He was advised by Seneca, a wise philosopher. But Nero's later years were marked by tyranny, extravagance, and the persecution of Christians. Some argue his mother's influence was a factor, but his unchecked power allowed his dark side to flourish. A famous, if controversial, example is the Stanford prison experiment in 1971, led by Philip Zimbardo. While it simulated power dynamics, not real kingship, it highlighted how quickly people can adopt roles. Guards given power over prisoners became abusive. Prisoners stripped of power became submissive. It showed how situations, not just personalities, can drive behavior. While it had ethical flaws, it sparked much debate about power's impact. Another concept is the hubris syndrome, coined by former British Foreign Secretary David Owen and psychiatrist Jonathan Davidson. They studied the behavior of leaders like Margaret Thatcher, George W. Bush, and Tony Blair. They found that long-term power can lead to excessive self-confidence, contempt for advice, and a belief in their own moral superiority. This can make leaders reckless and detached from reality. They start to believe they are beyond normal rules. The history of kings and emperors is full of examples. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, ruled for 72 years. He built Versailles, a symbol of absolute power. He saw himself as divinely chosen. Over time, his rule became increasingly autocratic. He pursued costly wars and believed himself indispensable. His decisions, often made in isolation, led to great suffering for his people, though he likely saw them as necessary for France's glory. So power doesn't just offer opportunity, it can warp perception, it can erode judgment. It can turn a person into a tyrant sometimes without them even realizing the change. The very thing that elevates them can also destroy their inner self and their capacity for human connection. But how much of this corruption is inherent to power itself, and how much depends on the individual's existing personality? Does power reveal who a person truly is, Or does it actively create a new, less moral self? Can a king truly resist the psychological pull of absolute authority, or is it an inevitable fate? And if power corrupts, can it ever be truly shared without diluting its effect on the individual holding the ultimate title? Number 15, does the crown trap a king? Many might think a king has ultimate freedom, they can do what they want, but often the crown itself becomes a prison. It locks them into a role, a set of expectations, and a rigid system that limits their personal agency. This is a concept similar to learned helplessness in psychology, though not in the same sense of giving up. It's more about like being trapped by the very structures that like define their power. Take King Louis XVI of France. He inherited a system burdened by centuries of tradition and debt. He wanted to make reforms, but he was constantly caught between the demands of the nobility, the church, and the struggling common people. He tried to be a good ruler. He supported the American Revolution, but he couldn't break free from the traditions and financial crises that were building. He became a symbol of a hated system, even if he personally wasn't the tyrannical figure many later portrayed him to be. He famously tried to flee France, showing he felt trapped and wanted out, but he was caught and eventually executed. His fate shows how a king can be a prisoner of his own position and the historical forces around him. Another example is King George III of Great Britain. He wanted to be a strong ruler, but he was constrained by Parliament and the rising power of a constitutional monarchy. He struggled with mental illness, now thought to be porphyria. This illness, combined with the immense pressures of losing the American colonies and constant political infighting, likely deepened his sense of being trapped and unable to control events despite being king. His later years were marked by severe episodes, further incapacitating him. Historian Martin Seligman's work on learned helplessness, though often applied to individuals in oppressive situations, offers an interesting parallel. It describes how people might stop trying to escape a negative situation if they believe they have no control over it. For a king, this might mean accepting the limits of their power, the demands of court, the expectations of succession, or the weight of tradition. They might feel they have no personal choice outside of what the crown dictates. The life of many European monarchs, especially after the rise of constitutionalism, became more about symbolism and less about direct power. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, for instance, had to navigate the rise of fascism under Mussolini. He remained king, but his real power was greatly diminished. He was caught between his oath, the powerful dictator, and the will of the people. He was king, yet largely powerless to stop the country's slide into war and dictatorship. The rigid etiquette and ceremonial duties also contribute to this feeling of being trapped. For centuries, monarchs have lived lives dictated by strict protocols, public appearances, and an almost clockwork schedule. Every meal, every interaction, every public statement is scrutinized. There's little room for genuine spontaneity or personal desire. The crown dictates their daily existence. So, if a king feels powerless even when holding the highest office, what does that say about the nature of power itself? Can any person truly exercise free will when bound by such a colossal institution? What kind of mental toll does this constant lack of true personal choice inflict over decades? And how much of a king's perceived inaction or weakness might actually be a symptom of their entrapment rather than a personal failing? Number 14, does the divine right weigh too heavily? For centuries, many monarchs claimed divine right. This idea stated that a king's authority came directly from God, not from the people or any earthly power. This gave them immense authority, but it also put an incredible, almost impossible burden on them. If you are chosen by God, you are expected to be perfect. You are expected to be infallible. You are expected to bring prosperity and justice. Failing meant failing God and failing the heavens. King James I of England, James VI of Scotland, was a strong believer in divine right. He wrote a treatise called The True Law of Free Monarchies. In it, he argued that kings were like little gods on earth. This belief gave him the confidence to rule absolutely, but it also placed immense pressure on him. Every mistake, every bad harvest, every military defeat could be seen as a sign that he was not living up to his divine mandate. This could lead to intense anxiety and self-doubt, or, conversely, to a stubborn refusal to admit fault, believing himself always in the right. Consider the religious monarchs of various eras. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt were seen as living gods. This gave them incredible power, but also an obligation to maintain cosmic order Ma'at. If the Nile didn't flood, if there was famine, It could be seen as their failure to appease the gods, or even a sign of their own unworthiness. Such a burden would be crushing for any human. The psychology of belief plays a big part here. If a king truly believes they are God's chosen, their ego would be immense. But so would their fear of divine retribution for their errors. This can lead to hypervigilance, paranoia, or even a desperate need to project an image of perfection, no matter the internal struggle. They can't just be a flawed human, they must be a vessel of divine will. Queen Elizabeth I, while not a believer in absolute divine right in the same way James I was, still used religious legitimacy. She famously declared herself a virgin queen, married to her country. This elevated her status to almost mythical proportion. It gave her immense power and loyalty. But it also meant sacrificing a personal life, always maintaining an immaculate public image, and always being above ordinary human desires. The pressure to maintain this persona, to always be strong and unwavering, must have been immense. She couldn't show weakness, she couldn't have a simple human moment of doubt or fear. This constant pressure to embody perfection, to be more than human, can lead to severe psychological strain. It can disconnect a king from their own humanity. It can make them feel isolated, as no one else can truly understand the weight of such a divine calling. It's a heavy crown to wear, not just physically, but spiritually and psychologically. But if a king genuinely believes in their divine right, does that belief give them strength, or does it ultimately lead to delusion and greater psychological fragility? What happens to a king's faith when facing profound personal or national failures? Does the belief in divine right insulate a king from self-doubt, or does it intensify the stakes of every decision? And in societies where divine right was accepted, how did the populace's own beliefs about their king's sacred status influence the king's internal world? Number 13, can a king ever have a true peer? Loneliness at the top is a common problem for leaders. For a king, it's magnified. Who can truly understand their unique burdens? Who can they speak to freely without worrying about manipulation, betrayal, or political gain? The answer, often, is no one. A king often lives in a world where everyone around them has a motive, where advice is filtered, and where genuine friendship is a dangerous luxury. Elizabeth I, again, offers a stark example. She famously said she was married to England. She never married a man. Part of this was political, but it also reflected a practical reality who could be her equal. No consort could truly share her power. No subject could truly understand her unique position. Her closest advisors, like William Cecil, were incredibly loyal, but they were still subjects. They still served her. There was always a power imbalance. This meant Elizabeth had to make crucial decisions alone, relying on her own judgment, with no true equal to confide in. The Roman Emperor Augustus, after consolidating power, often spent time alone or with a very small, trusted inner circle. Even then, he was the emperor. There was a clear hierarchy. His friend Agrippa was indispensable. Yet Agrippa was still a subordinate. The dynamic was never one of true equals sharing the same burdens and pressures of ultimate rule. This kind of isolation, where even friends and family exist in a different power stratum, creates a unique psychological environment. Psychological studies on power and social connection often show that leaders can feel more isolated. They might have many people around them, but few, if any, true confidants. This lack of genuine connection can lead to increased stress, difficulty in processing emotions, and a feeling of alienation. Psychologist Robert Sternberg's work on leadership often touches on the importance of support networks, which are very difficult for monarchs to truly build. Consider the modern context. Even today's constitutional monarchs, like those in the UK, have very few people they can truly confide in about the unique pressures of their role. While they have spouses and family, the weight of the crown is still theirs alone. Prince Harry has spoken openly about the pressures of royal life and how it affected his mental health, highlighting the isolation even within a family unit when one is part of the institution. This lack of true peers means a king is constantly on stage. They cannot let their guard down. They cannot reveal weakness. They must always maintain the image of strength and composure. This emotional labor is draining. It means suppressing personal feelings and always projecting a royal facade. Over time, this can lead to a profound sense of loneliness, where the king is always the king and rarely just a person. But if a king cannot find a true peer, how does this chronic isolation affect their decision-making over time? Does it make them more prone to error or more self-reliant? Can a king truly understand the experiences of their subjects if they are so utterly disconnected from ordinary life? And what psychological strategies, if any, do monarchs develop to cope with this unique and profound loneliness? Number 12, how do royal families survive the crown's strain? The pressures of kingship don't just fall on the monarch. They ripple through the entire royal family. Spouses, children, siblings, everything. Everyone connected to the crown feels its weight. The family becomes an extension of the state, often sacrificing personal happiness for dynastic duty. This creates intense family dynamics, often filled with jealousy, rivalry, expectation, and resentment. And think about Henry VIII and his many wives. Anne Boleyn's failure to produce a male heir for him led to her execution. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was cast aside. These were not just personal tragedies. They were dynastic crises driven by the absolute need for a male successor to secure the Tudor line. The pressure on the queen to produce an heir, and specifically a son, was immense. Her worth was tied directly to her fertility and the sex of her child. The Romanov family, Russia's last imperial family, lived under constant scrutiny and political threat. Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra faced immense pressure to maintain their absolute rule. Their only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia. This secret illness caused immense stress within the family. It made them withdraw and become vulnerable to figures like Rasputin. The need to protect the heir and the fear for his life deeply impacted the family's functioning and arguably contributed to their downfall. Marriages in royal families are often arranged for political reasons, not love. This means spouses might enter relationships with little emotional connection, forced to live a public life under constant scrutiny. Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert, while ultimately a loving one, began with intense pressure to produce heirs and to navigate complex political landscapes. Albert, as a consort, struggled to find his own role and purpose, often feeling overshadowed and underappreciated. Children born into royal families face an unparalleled destiny. Their lives are mapped out before they can speak. They are educated to rule, to represent, to endure. They often lack a normal childhood, free from public expectation. Modern examples, like Prince Charles now, King Charles III, spent decades as the heir apparent, his life always secondary to the ultimate role he was destined to play. The weight of this destiny can be incredibly heavy, leading to personal struggles, identity crises, and strained relationships within the family. Sibling rivalries are also common. The struggle for power or influence can tear families apart. The Wars of the Roses in England, a bloody conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York, was a brutal example of family members fighting for the throne. Even in less violent times, the pecking order within royal families can cause deep resentments and psychological scars. Family systems theory, often used in therapy, can illuminate these dynamics. Royal families are extreme examples of highly enmeshed systems where individual identities are often subsumed by the family role and expectations. This can lead to lack of autonomy, unhealthy communication patterns, and unresolved emotional issues. But how do individual members of a royal family differentiate themselves, if at all, from the collective identity of the crown? What kind of long-term psychological damage is inherited across generations in royal lines? Do these intense pressures make royal families stronger and more resilient, or more prone to dysfunction and breakdown? And in what ways do the spouses of monarchs truly cope with living in the shadow of the crown? Number 11. What physical toll does kingship exact? Being a king isn't just mentally exhausting, it's physically draining. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, the demanding schedules, and often the unhealthful diets of privilege can lead to severe health problems. History is full of monarchs who suffered from chronic illnesses, often exacerbated by the pressures of their role. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was one of the most powerful men in Europe. He ruled a vast empire for decades. But he suffered terribly from gout, epilepsy, and stomach ailments. He endured constant pain. His life was one of endless travel, warfare, and complex political negotiations. In 1556, utterly exhausted and worn down, he abdicated his many thrones. He retired to a monastery seeking peace and rest, dying 2 years later. His physical decline was a direct result of the immense pressures and responsibilities of his rule. Louis XV of France, known for his lavish lifestyle, also suffered from various ailments throughout his life, including depression. He inherited a kingdom plagued by debt and political unrest. The burdens of rule, coupled with his own personal struggles and a tendency towards melancholy, likely contributed to his declining health, and later, his perceived apathy towards the end of his reign. His famous quote, Après moi, le déluge, after me, the deluge, hinted at his deep weariness and perhaps his knowledge of the coming storm. Chronic stress is a known killer. It elevates cortisol levels, weakens the immune system, and contributes to heart disease, diabetes, and other serious conditions. For kings, stress was a daily companion. The threat of war, rebellion, assassination, and the weight of massive decisions created a constant state of high alert. This is similar to what is seen in modern studies of individuals in high-pressure jobs like CEOs or military leaders who often experience higher rates of stress-related illnesses. Historians and medical researchers have begun to re-examine the health of past monarchs. For instance, the illnesses of King George III of Britain, once attributed to madness, are now widely believed to have been porphyria, a genetic blood disorder. But the impact of the illness was undoubtedly worsened by the intense stress of his role, particularly during the American Revolution. The emotional and mental burden of losing his colonies and fighting a prolonged war would have severely aggravated any underlying condition. Even the diets of power could be detrimental. Rich foods, heavy drinking, and lack of exercise were common among royalty. Though Henry VIII, known for his athleticism in his youth, became obese and suffered from leg ulcers and other ailments in his later years. This, combined with the stress of his dynastic struggles, likely contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior and earlier death. So, the crown might symbolize health and vitality, but it often drained those who wore it. It demanded relentless effort, sacrificing personal well-being for the sake of the realm. The physical costs were real, often hidden behind the facade of royal splendor. But how much of a king's perceived tyranny or madness was actually a symptom of undiagnosed physical illness exacerbated by stress? Could better medical care and stress management have changed the course of history for some monarchs? Do modern constitutional monarchs with less absolute power experience fewer or different physical tolls? And is there a certain personality type that is physically better equipped to withstand the demands of kingship? Number 10, will history judge me kindly? Every king, whether they admit it or not, thinks about their legacy. How will they be remembered? Will they be a great king, a wise king, or a tyrant? This anxiety about one's place in history can be a powerful motivator, but also a crushing psychological burden. It can drive decisions, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was obsessed with his legacy. After decades of civil war, he presented himself as the restorer of the republic, even while consolidating absolute power. He meticulously crafted his public image. He commissioned grand building projects like the Mausoleum of Augustus and the Ara Pacis. He even wrote an account of his own accomplishments, Resqueste Divi Augusti, to ensure his narrative endured. This intense focus on legacy meant every decision, every action, was viewed through the lens of how it would be perceived by future generations. The famous poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley captures this perfectly. It describes a ruined statue of a king who once boasted of his greatness, only for his works to have crumbled into dust. This is the ultimate fear of any ruler, that all their efforts, their power, their supposed immortality will amount to nothing but forgotten rubble. This existential anxiety about meaning and lasting impact is unique to those whose lives are inextricably linked to the grand sweep of history. Think of the pharaohs of Egypt. They built pyramids and elaborate tombs, not just out of ego, but out of a profound belief in their own immortality and the need to secure their passage to the afterlife. Their entire lives and the resources of their kingdom were often geared towards this ultimate legacy project. The psychological weight of having to ensure one's eternal remembrance, to be literally monumental, must have been overwhelming. Studies on mortality salience in psychology show that when people are reminded of their own death, they tend to cling more strongly to their cultural worldviews and seek to leave a lasting mark. For a king, whose life is intrinsically tied to the state's survival, this drive is amplified. Their personal mortality becomes linked to the immortality of their reign or their dynasty. Even in modern times, with constitutional monarchs, the concern for legacy remains. Queen Elizabeth II was keenly aware of her role in history. Her dedication to duty and stability was partly a desire to preserve the monarchy's reputation and ensure its future. The pressure to avoid scandal, to always appear steadfast, and to maintain the image of the institution is a constant fight against the judgment of history. This anxiety about legacy can also lead to desperate acts. A king nearing the end of their reign might initiate wars or make grand, risky decisions to cement their name, regardless of the cost to their people. Their personal need for historical glory can overshadow prudent governance. The fear of being forgotten, or worse, remembered as a failure, is a constant gnawing presence. But how does a king differentiate between genuine historical ambition and a desperate need for ego validation? Does the pursuit of a grand legacy inevitably lead to tyranny or neglect of present-day problems? Can a king truly control how history remembers them, or are they ultimately at the mercy of future interpreters? And what happens psychologically to a king who realizes too late that their legacy is already sealed as one of failure? Number 9. What moral compromises do kings make? Machiavelli's The Prince, written in the early 16th century, famously advised rulers on how to gain and maintain power. His counsel often leaned towards pragmatism over morality. He suggested that a prince must be willing to be cruel, deceitful, and even ruthless if it serves the state. This isn't just cynical advice, it reflects a harsh psychological reality. Kings often have to make decisions that violate their personal morals for what they believe is the greater good. Consider Henry IV of France. Born a Huguenot Protestant, he faced a kingdom torn by religious wars. To bring peace and unify France, he converted to Catholicism, reportedly saying, "Paris is worth a mass." This was a profound personal and moral compromise. He abandoned his lifelong faith for political stability. While history largely remembers him as a great king who brought peace, imagine the internal struggle, the wrestling with conscience that such a decision would entail. The dirty hands problem in political philosophy explores this dilemma. It suggests that leaders sometimes must do morally questionable things to achieve a good outcome for the community. A king might have to execute a beloved relative to prevent civil war, or send thousands of soldiers to their deaths to defend the realm. These aren't choices most people ever face. The psychological burden of making such decisions, of knowing you have committed an act that goes against your own sense of right and wrong, can be immense. King Solomon in the Bible is known for his wisdom, but even he made morally questionable decisions, including having his half-brother Adonijah executed to secure his throne. This was done out of political necessity, to remove a potential rival and solidify his rule. While presented as a wise decision in the context of the story, it still involved a king ordering the death of his own kin for power. The leaders often develop a psychological mechanism to cope with these compromises. They might rationalize their actions, convincing themselves that the ends justify the means. Or they might compartmentalize their feelings, separating their personal conscience from their royal duty. This can lead to a hardening of the heart, a detachment from the human cost of their decisions as a survival mechanism. Even Queen Elizabeth I, often celebrated as a strong and wise ruler, made a profoundly difficult moral choice: the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was her cousin, a fellow queen, and a Catholic claimant to the English throne. After decades of imprisonment and numerous plots centered around Mary, Elizabeth finally signed her death warrant. It was a political necessity to secure her own reign and the Protestant succession, but it was a decision that reportedly caused her great anguish. She cried and signed, knowing the moral weight of killing a reigning monarch. The cumulative effect of these moral compromises can erode a king's sense of self. They might start to believe there is no true good or evil, only power and survival. This cynical view can lead to a deeper sense of isolation and a loss of personal integrity. But how do kings live with the profound guilt of making morally abhorrent decisions for the greater good? Does repeated moral compromise eventually desensitize a king, or does the weight simply accumulate? At what point does a necessary compromise become an act of tyranny? And what happens to the king's soul when they realize they have become the very thing they might have once detested? Number 8, how does a king live under constant threat? Imagine waking up every day knowing that people want you dead. This was the reality for countless kings. Assassination attempts, rebellions, palace coups, the threat of violent death was a constant shadow. This extreme level of chronic stress has profound psychological consequences, leading to paranoia, anxiety, and a state of hypervigilance. Julius Caesar, one of history's most powerful figures, was assassinated by senators in 44 BC. He had amassed immense power, but also enemies who feared his ambition. His violent end serves as a stark reminder that even at the pinnacle of power, vulnerability remains. The knowledge that even those closest to you could betray you fosters deep mistrust. Tsar Alexander II of Russia faced multiple assassination attempts, He survived several bombings and shootings before finally being killed by a nihilist bomb in 1881. For years, he lived under this constant threat. This experience must have been terrifying, leading to increased security, isolation, and a profound sense of anxiety. How could he trust anyone outside his most inner circle? And even within that circle, suspicion would linger. The psychology of living in a high-threat environment is well documented in studies of soldiers, police, and victims of violence. It often leads to post-traumatic stress symptoms, including nightmares, flashbacks, hyperarousal, and difficulty concentrating. For a king, this battle fatigue would be a daily reality endured not for a tour of duty, but for an entire reign. The security measures surrounding kings became incredibly elaborate. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had an extensive network of spies and informers throughout his court and kingdom. This was necessary to protect him from plots, but it also contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion. It meant the king himself was always watching, always guarded, always aware of potential threats. This constant monitoring of others and being monitored is exhausting. Historical accounts show many kings becoming increasingly paranoid in their later years. For Henry VIII, after a jousting accident that led to chronic pain and possibly brain damage, became highly suspicious, executing many former allies and even wives. While physical injury played a role, the constant threat of plots against him, particularly after the break with Rome, likely fueled his paranoia. The Roman emperors were particularly susceptible. The Praetorian Guard, their personal bodyguards, often became kingmakers themselves, sometimes assassinating emperors they had sworn to protect. This added another layer of fear. Your protectors could become your executioners. This never-ending fear takes a massive toll. It erodes trust in others. It fosters a worldview where everyone is a potential enemy. It can turn a once benevolent ruler into a ruthless tyrant, always seeking to eliminate perceived threats, even if those threats are largely imaginary. The psychological cost is an inner life filled with anxiety, suspicion, and a pervasive sense of dread. But how does a king differentiate between real threats and paranoid delusions after years of living in danger? Does this constant exposure to threat make them more resilient or simply more damaged? How do they build any genuine human connection when trust is a luxury they cannot afford? And what happens to a kingdom when its ruler is perpetually living in fear and suspicion? Number 7, how does a king lose their true self? When someone becomes the king, their personal identity often gets subsumed by the role. They are no longer just a person with their own quirks and desires. They become an institution, a symbol, a living embodiment of the state. This can lead to a profound loss of self, where the line between the private individual and the public monarch blurs and eventually disappears. King Charles I of England, when facing execution in 1649, saw himself not just as a man dying, but as a martyr king. He truly believed in his divine right to rule, and that his death was a sacrifice for his people and the Church of England. His identity as the king was so deeply ingrained that it superseded his personal survival. He was ready to die for the crown, becoming the role completely. Irving Goffman's dramaturgical theory, while typically applied to everyday social interactions, is incredibly relevant here. He argued that people are like actors on a stage, presenting different fronts depending on the audience and situation. For a king, the stage is immense, and the performance is constant. There is rarely a backstage where they can be their authentic selves. They are always performing the role of monarch. This relentless performance can make it hard to remember who they are without the costume and the lines. Consider Queen Elizabeth II. From a young age, she was trained for her role. Her entire life was dedicated to duty and service. She rarely expressed strong personal opinions publicly. She was the embodiment of stability and tradition. While admired for this, it also meant her personal identity was almost entirely fused with her role as sovereign. One rarely heard about Elizabeth Windsor, the woman. It was always Queen Elizabeth II, the monarch. This kind of self-effacement for the sake of the crown is a tremendous psychological act. The pressure to always be the king means suppressing personal emotions, desires, and vulnerabilities. A king cannot publicly show fear, sadness, or doubt. They must always appear strong, resolute, and in control. This emotional labor is exhausting and can lead to a sense of detachment from one's own feelings. They become so good at playing the part that the part becomes them. Psychological theories on ego identity and self-concept highlight the importance of having a clear sense of who you are, separate from your roles. For a king, this separation is almost impossible. Their very name, their lineage, their entire existence is defined by their position. They are born into it, live it, and die as it. This can lead to an identity crisis, or more likely, an absorption of the role so complete that the original self fades away. When monarchs retire or abdicate, as Charles V did, or as Pope Benedict XVI did in modern times, they often speak of rediscovering themselves or seeking a simpler life. This implies that the role they had held for so long had indeed consumed a significant part of their personal identity. It's a stripping away of a monumental public self to find the private person underneath, if that person still exists. But if a king loses their personal identity, do they truly suffer, or does the role provide a new, powerful sense of self? Can a king ever reclaim their private identity after decades of public performance? Is the total absorption into the role a form of psychological survival or a tragic loss? And what are the implications for a nation when its leader is an institution rather than a fully formed human being? Number 6, what is the pressure of producing an heir? For dynastic monarchies, the most critical duty of a king and queen was to produce an heir. Not just any heir, but typically a male one. The continuation of the line, the stability of the kingdom, and the prevention of civil war all rested on this singular biological function. This placed immense, crushing pressure on both the monarch and their spouse. Henry VIII's desperate quest for a male heir is perhaps the most famous example. His obsession led to the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the break with the Roman Catholic Church, and the execution of Anne Boleyn. His personal happiness, the fate of his wives, and the religious future of England were all dictated by this one overwhelming pressure. Imagine the psychological torture for Anne Boleyn knowing her life literally depended on giving birth to a son. She miscarried and gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The consequence was her death. This pressure wasn't just about personal succession, it was about national stability. A secure succession prevented internal strife. The lack of a clear male heir often led to power struggles, civil wars, and invasions. The War of the Roses in England was precisely about this. The fear of a disputed succession was a constant source of anxiety for monarchs and their advisors. For queens, the pressure was particularly acute. Their value, their position, and often their very survival depended on their fertility and their ability to bear a son. They underwent intense scrutiny, their pregnancies were public events, miscarriages were national tragedies. This is a profound form of gendered psychological pressure, where a woman's entire identity and worth were tied to her reproductive capacity for the state. The genetics of royal families also became a factor. Close intermarriage to maintain dynastic ties sometimes led to genetic problems, like hemophilia, which plagued the royal houses of Europe, including the Romanovs. The need to preserve purity of bloodlines, combined with the need for an heir, created a dangerous biological lottery. Even when an heir was produced, the pressure didn't stop. The heir had to survive childhood, which was precarious in earlier centuries. They had to be educated for their future role, often with little freedom for personal development. They had to prove their worth. The relationship between king and heir could be fraught with tension, as the king saw his eventual replacement and the heir yearned for their turn. Psychologically, this constant focus on reproduction and lineage can make relationships transactional rather than emotional. Love and personal connection might take a back seat to the duty of procreation. It dehumanizes the process, turning partners into instruments of dynastic survival. The anxiety of fertility and the gender of a child are private matters for most. For kings and queens, they were public, existential crises. But how did monarchs cope with the failure to produce an heir, and how did that impact their self-worth and reign? What kind of psychological toll did the constant fear of a barren queen or a sickly prince take on a king? Does the modern shift away from absolute primogeniture relieve some of this historical pressure? And how much did this dynastic pressure contribute to the brutal decisions made by kings regarding their families? Number 5, what happens when a king suffers imposter syndrome? Even those at the very pinnacle of power can feel like frauds. This feeling, known as imposter syndrome, is the belief that one is not truly competent or deserving of their position, despite evidence to the contrary. For a king, born into the role or thrust into it unexpectedly, this can be a crippling psychological burden. King George VI, the subject of the film The King's Speech, is a perfect example. He was never meant to be king. His older brother, Edward VIII, abdicated, pushing George onto the throne. George was a quiet man suffering from a severe stammer, and he felt deeply unprepared for the immense responsibility of leading a nation on the brink of World War II. He genuinely believed he wasn't good enough. This is classic imposter syndrome. He struggled immensely, but ultimately, with the help of a speech therapist, he rose to the challenge, becoming a respected wartime monarch. The founders of the concept of imposter phenomenon, psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, initially observed it in high-achieving women. But it applies to anyone who feels like their success is due to luck or deception, not their own merit. For a king, especially one who inherited their position, the question, "Do I deserve this?" can be constant. They might feel they haven't earned it, or that they are simply playing a part. Consider some reluctant rulers throughout history. Many Roman emperors, particularly after the early Julio-Claudian dynasty, were chosen by the army or forced into power. They might have lacked the ambition or belief in their own capability. Emperor Claudius, for instance, was seen as somewhat bumbling and avoided public life. He was pushed into the role after Caligula's assassination. He reportedly hid from the Praetorian Guard who found him. Yet, he proved to be a surprisingly effective emperor. His initial reluctance and feeling of unworthiness likely stemmed from a form of imposter syndrome. This feeling can lead to various coping mechanisms. A king might overcompensate, working tirelessly to prove their worth. They might become overly reliant on advisors, fearing their own judgment, or they might retreat, becoming indecisive or withdrawn, paralyzed by the fear of being exposed as incompetent. The pressure to always project an image of strength and wisdom makes it impossible to admit these feelings of inadequacy publicly. The legend of King Arthur, who had to pull a sword from a stone, is a mythical representation of this very idea. Only the true king could perform the feat. It's a way of proving worthiness. But for real kings, there's no magic sword, there's just the overwhelming weight of expectation and the gnawing doubt inside. This internal struggle can be deeply isolating. A king cannot confide in their subjects or even most advisors about feeling like a fraud. It would undermine their authority, so they suffer in silence, constantly battling their inner critic while maintaining a facade of absolute confidence. The irony is that often these kings who feel like imposters are precisely the ones who are most humble and conscientious, making them potentially better rulers than those with unchecked confidence. But how do kings reconcile the public expectation of their divine right or innate superiority with their own private feelings of inadequacy? Does overcoming imposter syndrome make a king stronger or just more resigned to their fate? What kind of internal dialogue is constant for a king who believes they don't belong on the throne? And how much of a king's perceived weakness or hesitation is actually a manifestation of this profound internal struggle? Number 4, how does public scrutiny devour a king's private life? Being a king means living under a microscope. Every action, every word, every relationship is subject to intense public scrutiny. There is no real private life. The king's life is the state's life, and the people feel they have a right to judge it. This constant surveillance can be incredibly damaging to a person's psychological well-being. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, is a tragic example. She came from Austria, an outsider, and was thrust into the lavish, gossipy, and highly political court of Versailles. Her every move was watched. Her fashion choices, her friends, her perceived extravagance, and eventually her inability to produce an heir for years became subjects of intense public criticism and vicious rumors. Pamphlets spread false stories about her. She became a symbol of royal excess and was demonized by the public. The constant scrutiny and the relentless, often unfair, criticism contributed to her downfall and ultimate execution. Her personal struggles were twisted into public accusations. Even in modern constitutional monarchies, the royal family lives in a fishbowl. Princess Diana, in the late 20th century, famously spoke about the intense media pressure she faced. Her life, her marriage, her charitable work, and her personal struggles were endlessly dissected by the press and public. She felt hounded, losing her sense of privacy and autonomy. The psychological toll was immense, contributing to her feelings of isolation and despair. Sociologist Irving Goffman's concept of front stage and backstage applies here. For kings, the front stage is almost their entire life. There is very little backstage where they can truly relax and be themselves. This lack of personal space and the constant need to perform a public role can lead to extreme stress and a feeling of being constantly on. This isn't just about media. In earlier centuries, the court itself was a constant source of scrutiny and gossip. Courtiers, always vying for favor, would watch the king and queen intensely, reporting back to their factions. The king was never truly alone, even in his own chambers, as servants, guards, and advisors were always present or nearby. The psychological impact of such intense and constant scrutiny includes anxiety, paranoia, depression, and a loss of personal identity. People need private space to process emotions, to be vulnerable, and to simply exist without judgment. When this is taken away, the self can become fractured. The king might internalize the criticisms, leading to self-doubt, or become hardened and cynical, building emotional walls. This relentless public gaze means that a king can never truly be spontaneous. Every decision, every offhand remark, every gesture could be misinterpreted or used against them. This creates a state of perpetual self-monitoring, which is emotionally exhausting. They are always aware of how they are perceived rather than how they genuinely feel. But how much of a king's public persona is a deliberate construction, and how much is an involuntary adaptation to constant scrutiny? Can a king ever truly form genuine private relationships when their every interaction is under potential public judgment? Does living under a microscope make a king more resilient or more fragile? And in an age of global media, what new psychological pressures do modern monarchs face compared to their historical counterparts? Number 3, how do kings bear the weight of life and death decisions? Most people never have to make a decision that directly determines the fate of thousands or even millions of lives. Ancient kings, however, regularly did, whether it was declaring war, ordering an execution, or deciding how to respond to famine. These life and death choices carried an unimaginable psychological burden. Think of monarchs during wartime. Queen Elizabeth I agonized over sending English troops to fight in the Netherlands, knowing many would die, but believing it was necessary to protect Protestant England from Catholic Spain. Her decision to execute Mary, Queen of Scots, was another example. She knew it would spark outrage, but felt it was the only way to secure her throne. These were not easy choices. Historians note her internal struggle and the deep personal cost. The Peloponnesian War, as chronicled by Thucydides, shows leaders making agonizing choices between peace and war, knowing the immense human cost. These decisions were rarely clear-cut. There were always risks, always trade-offs. The psychological pressure of knowing that your judgment could lead to widespread death and suffering is immense. Psychological studies on military commanders who make similar life and death decisions show high levels of stress, moral injury, and sometimes PTSD. Commanders often struggle with the weight of sending soldiers into harm's way. For a king, this responsibility extended to the entire realm. They were not just a commander, they were the ultimate authority. The decision to execute a person, whether for treason or other crimes, was also solely the king's. This power, while absolute, carried a heavy moral and psychological price. Louis XIII of France, for example, had to approve numerous executions for political reasons, often at the urging of his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. While Richelieu took much of the political heat, the ultimate responsibility and the signing of the death warrant rested with the king. Imagine the internal conflict, especially if the king had personal doubts about the guilt or the necessity of the execution. A king's decisions could also impact the lives of their subjects through policies on taxes, law, and economic management. A wrong decision could lead to famine, rebellion, or poverty. The Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria's obsession with building extravagant castles, while beautiful, drained the state coffers and led to economic hardship for his people. While he likely didn't intend harm, his decisions had life-altering consequences. The psychological impact of being responsible for such widespread suffering, whether intended or not, is profound. This weight of responsibility can lead to indecision, paralysis, or, conversely, a hardening of the heart to cope. Some kings might become ruthless to avoid feeling the pain of their decisions. Others might become overwhelmed, unable to act decisively. The constant threat of making the wrong choice, a choice that could cost lives or plunge the kingdom into chaos, is a unique burden of kingship. But how do kings mentally process the immense loss of life or suffering that results from their decisions? Does this burden make them more empathetic or more detached over time? What kind of psychological defense mechanisms do monarchs develop to cope with the reality of being a decider of fate? And is there any way for a human being to truly bear such a massive burden without becoming psychologically fractured? Number 2, how does paranoia eat away at a king's trust? Trust is a fragile thing for anyone, But for a king, it's a dangerous luxury. Surrounded by ambitious courtiers, rival factions, and constant threats, a king often lives in a state of heightened suspicion. This can lead to profound paranoia, eating away at their ability to trust anyone, even those closest to them. Henry VIII, in his later years, became notoriously paranoid. His reign was marked by a series of betrayals, real and imagined. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had served him loyally for years, was executed on charges of treason. Henry had become so suspicious that he saw threats everywhere, even among his most devoted servants. This paranoia led to arbitrary arrests and executions, creating a climate of fear in his court. No one felt safe. The biographies of powerful figures often highlight this erosion of trust. Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Lyndon B. Johnson, for example, shows how Johnson, as he gained more power, became increasingly isolated and suspicious of even his closest advisors. He would test their loyalty, make them perform demeaning tasks, and doubt their motives. This isn't unique to kings, but the stakes are much higher. Roman emperors frequently suffered from extreme paranoia. Tiberius, after the death of his son, retreated to the island of Capri, ruling through correspondence. He became increasingly suspicious of the Senate and even his own family. His reign was marked by a series of treason trials and executions driven by his deep-seated fear of plots against him. This intense paranoia made him cruel and isolated, ultimately leading to a reign of terror. Psychologically, living in an environment where betrayal is a constant possibility creates a state of chronic hypervigilance. The brain is constantly scanning for threats. This can lead to a distortion of reality, where neutral actions are interpreted as hostile and normal disagreements are seen as conspiracies. It's a form of psychological self-defense, but it destroys the capacity for genuine human connection. A king needs loyal advisors, but how can they truly assess loyalty when everyone has something to gain or lose from their favor? Every smile, every whispered conversation, every piece of advice can be seen through the lens of potential deception. This creates a deeply isolating psychological prison. The king might even become suspicious of their own family, fearing rivals for the throne. The historical accounts are replete with stories of kings turning on their own kin. Ivan the Terrible of Russia, known for his extreme cruelty and paranoia, even killed his own son in a fit of rage. While he later deeply regretted it, his actions illustrate the extreme lengths to which paranoia can drive a monarch. This constant distrust can also lead to misjudgments. A king who is too paranoid might alienate loyal supporters, leaving themselves vulnerable to actual threats. They might dismiss sound advice, believing it to be a veiled attempt at manipulation. The psychological damage of paranoia doesn't just harm the king, it harms the entire kingdom. But can a king truly afford to trust anyone, given the historical precedents of betrayal and ambition? Is some level of paranoia a necessary survival mechanism for a ruler, or is it always destructive? How do kings discern genuine loyalty from cunning manipulation when their life is on the line? And what happens to a king's mind when the only people they feel they can trust are themselves, and even then, doubt creeps in? Number 1, what is the loneliness of the throne? The most profound psychological pressure of being the king might be the intense, unshakable loneliness of the throne. Everyone looks to the king, but who does the king look to? At the very top, there are no true equals. The monarch is set apart, isolated by their power, their position, and the immense weight of their responsibilities. Louis XIV, the Sun King, created the magnificent court of Versailles, filled with thousands of courtiers. He was surrounded by people constantly, yet he was utterly alone in his decisions. He was the center of everything, but also deeply isolated. His elaborate court rituals, while reinforcing his power, also kept everyone at a distance. He dined in public, but truly alone in his thoughts. This paradox of being surrounded by people, yet profoundly isolated, is a defining feature of kingship. Research by Manfred F.R. Ketz de Vries, a psychoanalyst and professor of leadership, often highlights the isolation faced by powerful leaders. They operate at a different level, making decisions that others cannot fully grasp. This creates a psychological chasm between them and everyone else. For a king, this is amplified 1,000-fold. Consider the burdens mentioned earlier, the weight of life and death decisions, the constant threat of assassination, the moral compromises, the scrutiny, the fear of imposter syndrome. All these burdens are carried alone. There's no one who can truly share the full psychological weight of the crown. Even a spouse or closest advisor, while offering support, does not bear the ultimate responsibility. that falls squarely on the king. This profound loneliness can lead to deep melancholy and depression. Many historical accounts describe kings who, despite their power and splendor, were deeply unhappy or withdrawn. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, as mentioned, increasingly isolated himself in his castles, retreating from his duties and social contact. His psychological state was deeply affected by his inability to cope with the demands of kingship and the overwhelming loneliness of his position. Modern leaders, even presidents or prime ministers, often speak of the immense loneliness of their office. They might have a team, but the buck stops with them. For a king, this feeling is exacerbated by the often lifelong nature of their rule and the historical and symbolic weight they carry. It's not just a job, it's their entire identity, their destiny. The lack of true peers means a king cannot unburden themselves fully. They cannot complain about the job, express doubt, or show weakness without undermining their authority. They must always maintain a facade of strength and composure, no matter the internal turmoil. This emotional repression contributes significantly to their isolation. The crown, for all its glory, can be the loneliest object in the world. It sets the wearer apart, elevating them above humanity, but at the cost of genuine human connection and the solace that comes from shared experience. It's a gilded cage, providing ultimate power, but stripping away the most basic human need, companionship among equals. But is the loneliness of the throne an inevitable consequence of ultimate power, or a failure of the king to connect? Does isolation make a king more susceptible to bad advice or more self-reliant? Can a king ever truly escape the profound solitude of their position, even in retirement or abdication? And what untold psychological toll has this unique form of loneliness exacted on countless monarchs throughout history?